Yeah, I would like to welcome you. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Our seventh chapter in the Mutation lecture series already. I'm pretty happy to welcome you. I'm Elka Ostimura. I'm the director of an international and transdisciplinary artists in residence program in Stuttgart in Germany, in the southwest of Germany. Yeah, this lecture series started already in a quite new program, the Akademie Schloss Solitude, together with the partner, the KfW Foundation. And here I would like to welcome Daniela Leikam from the foundation. We started a new program in order to foster the transdisciplinary approach. 7 international artists, researchers, and thinkers came together in order to work, to reflect, to work on this topic of mutations. Here, every single fellow, I soon will introduce you to them, them to you. I would like to mention that these artists decided to invite experts for specific reflection on a topic like mutation. And herefore, I would like to welcome Sophia Roosth. Sophia, hello. We welcome you warmly. You are right now in New York in the library, in the Central Library, in the Center for Scholars and Writers. And we will hear more of your research, the topic of the title of your lecture today, and say the fossil responded. You will be introduced by Ana Maria Gomez Lopez, one of the fellows who decided to invite you. I'm really, really happy to welcome you here. And before I hand over to my colleague Daniela Leikam, I really would like to introduce you to the group of fellows here. So first of all, I would like to introduce you to Ana Maria Gomez Lopez, based in Netherlands, from the US and Colombia originally. She is an artist, researcher, writer, and I would also like to introduce you to Clara Joe, a video artist. Hello, Clara. Maxwell Mutanda, multidisciplinary researcher, visual artist, and designer. Hello, Maxwell. And Joanna Quiroga, visual artist and philosopher. I also would like to introduce you to Sabina Hojuan, a media and sound artist, and Angela Anderson, a video artist and researcher. Grayson Earl, a new media artist, also from the US. So I would also like to welcome Rose Field, a young curator and the coordinator of this project. And yeah, I wish us a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us. And now I would like to hand over to my colleague, Daniela Leikam. Thank you.
Thank you, Elke. I will keep it very brief. I think most important things have been said, but also, of course, a very warm welcome from the foundation, KfW Stiftung, KfW Foundation, based in Frankfurt. And after we took a 1-week break this last week, we are now refreshed and have clear minds to take a new spin on the topic of mutations, discuss, challenge, maybe employ different, even new concepts of mutations. So tonight, Sophia Roosth, who is, I quote, an anthropologist who writes about the contemporary life sciences, is somewhat teasingly asking us the question and say the fossil responded. So I'm looking forward and I'm very curious to hear if the fossil responded. And she was invited by Ana Maria. Thank you. Elke has already mentioned it. Thank you for doing so, Ana Maria. Also, a warm thank you to the entire group who is curating a network of ideas and knowledge that is been expanding each week that we have another lecture. So this network is available for all viewers to watch afterwards as well. You can find it online on the YouTube channel of the foundation, for example. There's also channels by the Akademie Schloss Solitude. Rose will provide you with all links. So feel free to browse in what's been said before. Thank you, Sophia Roosth, for contributing to this network of knowledge. We're really looking forward to hear the life science spin on things. I won't get tired of thanking our partner each week as well. Thank you, Elke. Thank you to the Akademie Schloss Solitude, and of course to curator Rose Fields and her thorough and intelligent coordination of the program. So Anna Maria will moderate this session, and Grayson Earle is supporting her behind the scenes. Thank you, Grayson. And both will make sure that all your questions in the audience are being responded in the Q&A at the end of this session. So make sure to ask away. The whole idea of this is to engage in a public dialogue and open our discussion rounds that have been actively maintained behind the scenes, and open them to the public, to your questions, to your input and ideas as well. So I'll keep it here, and I'd say let's get started. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Daniela. And well, let me really thank again everyone for making this event possible. But most of all, Sophia, I am extraordinarily happy that she agreed to be a participant in this lecture series. As Daniela said, Sophia is an anthropologist, a historian of the earth and life sciences, and I would really highlight that my relationship with her as a writer, because her texts, her articles, her book have really been key in my own work in trying to hone in on this concept of taphonomy, which some of you have heard already a bit of an intro, but not about me, about Sophia. She's written very broadly and can talk and speak to the theme of mutations from really the most cutting edge synthetic biology, and in her book, Synthetic, How Life Got Made from 2017. And more recently, a book to look forward to that is in process on geobiology. So going from the cutting edge and the contemporary to another version of the contemporary, looking at artifacts from the very distant past in her upcoming book, The Quick and the Dead, about scientists seeking ancient microbial life forms that are fossilized in stone. Sophia has been selected for several prestigious fellowships. One that I highlight significantly is the Berlin Prize from the American Academy in Berlin, where I met her in 2016. But she's also been at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women at Brown University, and the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, where she is currently right now as we speak. She will be joining the faculty of NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study this fall, and will also be returning to Berlin soon as a Max Planck Society Sabbatical Award Laureate. And as I said, I'm tremendously happy to have Sophia, who has agreed not only to share some recent work, excerpts that are going to be anchored in this conversation through images that we have both selected. And I, without further ado, would like to give the floor to Sophia as I first pull up this PowerPoint, and the intriguing title, excuse me, one moment, of this lecture is "And Say the Fossil Responded," as Daniela has highlighted. I too would very much like to know how and if the fossil responded. And again, without further ado, to Sophia.
Well, thank you, Anna Maria, for the invitation, and also for that incredibly generous introduction, and also my gratitude to Elke and Daniela for hosting, and to Rose for all of her work behind the scenes. So, "And Say the Fossil Responded" is loosely drawn from a chapter based on a lecture that Derrida gave, and the talk that he gave was called "And Say the Animal Responded." And Say the Animal Responded poses a question in which he admits to feeling embarrassment for being naked in front of his cat. And this opens up a philosophical question about what is human ethics vis-a-vis animals. What is the relationship between humans and animals? And most importantly, for his purposes and riffing on Lacan, he poses the question, what's the difference between reaction and response in animals? I can say more about that later. I think in particular, there is a strong relationship between the way we think about fossils and traces with regard to humans, animals, and even historicity. But for my purposes, I wanted to talk about whether the fossil responded, beginning with some text that I'm currently working with. So this is the first few paragraphs of "And Say the Fossil Responded." I was for a time lucky enough to greet an ancient meta-organism every morning on my way to work. Sunning itself in the corner of a long, glassed-in hallway beside a stump of petrified wood, the unassuming stone was roughly the color, silhouette, and size of an elderly tortoise, domed and saddlebacked, though it moved even more slowly. Oftentimes, I would pass it, and my impulse is perpetually to call it them, for reasons that I can also discuss more. In the early morning, to discover that it had been sullied in the night, as cleaning staff would balance a blue plastic recycling bin on its uppermost cuticle after emptying the day's paper waste. For the better half of a semester, an abandoned coffee thermos perched on the stone. Late in the year, it would be obscured beneath a shoal of discarded exam booklets. I felt as if the stone and I shared an understanding, because in 2014, I had begun to immerse myself as an anthropologist in the work and worlds of geobiologists, which is to say scientists who study the coevolution of biological life and planetary history across spans of deep time. Having learned from geobiologists how to look for and think about fossils that predate the Cambrian explosion, some 542 million years ago, I could readily identify this particular stone as a stromatolite, the fossilized body of a once living bacterial mat that had lived and flourished, breathed and metabolized, and eventually congealed into a concrete bulwark against the wave action of an alkaline sea billions of years before anything like plant or animal life first arose. Stromatolites are the only ancient fossils visible to the naked eye. They are in some respects similar to contemporary coral reefs, if those reefs had been built eons ago and by microbes instead of by animals, on a pale young planet entirely alien to our contemporary world. So if you were to cut the entire history of Earth in half, the stromatolite lived and died closer in time to the formation of the solar system than to me. What I'm saying is the stone gave me perspective. So much so that after a few years, it began to occupy an outsized role in my psychic landscape, and, as can happen in such cases, appeared to me in dreams. These dreams would begin more or less the same as my waking mornings, sun slanting into the hallway, stromatolite degraded by detritus of higher education. The dream would only reveal itself as such when I spoke to the stromatolite, and it duly responded. The conversation by my lights rarely varied and ran roughly as follows. Me, I would say, stromatolite, why do you allow yourself to be treated this way? You don't deserve this. Why don't you tell anyone that you're a magnificent ancient being? And the stromatolite would respond, maybe the reason I've endured this long is because no one recognizes that I'm remarkable. And so if I had had the lucidity to do so, I might have asked the stromatolite other sorts of questions, given how intimately its history is imbricated in the search for both the origins of life on Earth and evidence that life has flourished elsewhere. And what if I had asked the stromatolite, what is life? And say the fossil had responded. So that's how I open up a kind of rumination on the place of stromatolites in Earth history, in the history of the life sciences, the earth sciences, but also theories about whether life exists elsewhere, most notably in Mars. So this is the work of astrobiologists, people who try to identify biosignatures for life elsewhere. And I use this to kind of open up a series of metaphors about the relationship between these rocks and theories of life on Earth. Anna Maria, I think you're muted.
I am, apologies. I was beginning to speak and say how really exciting this text is, and to kind of locate the talk in the context of sort of ancient or sort of distant life on Earth in terms of time, and distant life beyond Earth towards the extraterrestrial, which I think will be poles that we will be moving in between in this talk, but still staying on Earth for a moment, and sort of really still with the stromatolite as this, just fascinating artifact, of which I think in this photography, I obliquely perhaps even see a slight portrait of you in the lower right-hand side, if you are the photographer of said image. And having this kind of speak to me in terms of your dreamscape that you just set out with the stromatolite makes me want to ask you first, just generally out of curiosity, how you arrived to the stromatolite, aside from the fact of its presence, in the hallways in which you roamed, but also as the starting point, perhaps, for something that intrigued me from our compressed conversations prior to this moment, in terms of the definition of mutation, and sort of how that, the paleontological, if you will, in terms of how we define mutation now, has something to say, perhaps even earlier than the pregenetic definition, or the different iterations of the genetic that I see also amongst our audience. Luis Campos has helped us unpack in his scholarship, but basically to be able to locate that definition as broadly perhaps as your text and the streamscape has allowed us to enter. Now you're muted, unfortunately. Sorry.
This is like typical Zoom conferencing. So that's a really rich question, and in thinking about this presentation, I went back and looked at the etymology of mutation, and one of the things that I found quite telling is that mutation, and I'm sure everyone in your research group this year has spent a lot of time talking about this, has, at least in the life sciences in the past century or so, been really keyed to genetic mutation, right? Thinking about change intergenerationally and eventually leading up to something like speciation. The use of mutation in the genetic sense, and in particular with regard to nucleic acids, is obviously quite recent. And there's, in fact, an earlier history of talking about mutations in geological writing. So one of the examples that the OED gives of mutation is in a paleontological sense, which the OED describes as its original paleontological sense, meaning just a contemporaneous assemblage of individuals that are united by some continuity of form. And when the definition specifies individuals, these are individual fossils, right? So if you're looking stratigraphically at a layer of fossils, you'd see a layer in which the organisms look more or less the same, and then they would be different from an earlier layer of fossils, right? So there's this sense that there was common descent from a pre-existing species, and that layer is then called a mutation, right? And this is coming from the late 19th century, before we get to the modern synthesis, the way that geneticists began to think about cells and specific mutations happening on the level of a lifespan as being a driver for change. So I think that this sense of mutation is something that could be reflected upon more broadly as a way of talking about change across vast swaths of time. And of course, earlier uses of mutation also included things like historical change, political change, linguistic, phonological change, as well as musical change. So it comes from this really rich source material, and then the genetic meaning is quite drilled down and quite recent historically. And so you also posed a question about how I came to stromatolites. Is this sort of a biographical question?
Yes, I have to say, well, thank you for the sort of context of the etymological. I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson who said that language is fossil poetry, and that you brought us to that sort of fossilized roots of the word and sort of the accruals of it. It's very exciting, so I'll say that. But yes, I say you because it's lovely to see as creative a portrait as this one to be reflected in sort of just the temporal haze of one trying to take a photograph of something that really is almost, I would say, a photograph of itself, or as others perhaps more wiser than me have defined, sort of fossils being proto-photography. But I'm just intrigued, how, the stromatolites, let's say it's a niche and very rich area, I would say, of interest. I'm not trying to circumscribe that it would be odd that somebody would be interested in it, but specifically you, especially because so much of your writing, at least that I've now both heard but encountered more recently on the question of the geobiological, does speak from the first person, and a very generous way of defining the first person. I don't want to circumscribe it just to your biography, but if you could just speak to perhaps even who I intuit, if you are the holder of the fossil in your hand, in whatever way you wish to answer the question, I'm sure we will arrive to an interesting destination.
Well, I think as soon as I started looking at geobiology, and by geobiology, like I said, it's a sub-discipline of scientists who are interested in fossils, mostly microfossils, but not entirely, anything that lithified or silicified prior to the Cambrian explosion. So when I say Cambrian explosion, I mean this efflorescence of megascopic forms of animals arriving around 540 million years ago. And geobiologists are interested in things that are much older, right? So we're grading into a much deeper past of life on Earth, into the Archean, even into the Hadean, right? Before we even have something like continents forming. And so these questions have gotten tied up in questions of form and how we can think about fossilized form. And stromatolites are, like you can't talk about the history of geobiology without talking about the history of stromatolites, because these are the only only with an asterisk, but I won't get into it, only megascopic fossils that are appearing prior to the Cambrian explosion, and point a number of earth scientists and life scientists to really big questions about the origin of life on Earth, whether life could have arisen elsewhere, how life has changed over time, how it has morphed and mutated its own environment, right? So when you look at research into the origins of life on Earth, stromatolites are brought up over and over again in the conversation. And I've been tracking a lot of this literature into origins research around the beginning of the Cold War. And also that conversation about the origin of life on Earth was very much part of the beginning of astrobiological thinking around the same time. Stromatolites also appearing very importantly in that conversation. And another person or moment that I would flag in this history, although I could also talk about very early work trying to track what was called the dawn animal of Canada, which many samples of which are in fact now recognized as stromatolites, would be Lynn Margulies' work. Sorry, I just made a huge jump there. So the dawn animal of Canada is 1859. Lynn Margulies is writing in between the 60s and the 90s mostly. But the reason why I wanted to at least mention Lynn Margulies early in this conversation is because I think she's super important to thinking about mutation beyond, or thinking about how life has shaped the planet and how life evolves over time beyond a purely sort of neo-Darwinian nature red of tooth and claw model. And stromatolites were sort of like her totem creature, right? She thought with them for so long, looking both at really ancient stromatolites like the one I'm holding in my hand here. This is from the Strelley Pool Formation in Western Australia. So that's about 3.4 billion years ago. And she would also travel to Mexico and I'm missing a mask and someone just came into the room, hold on. She also looked at extant mats. So that is microbial mats that were flourishing in Mexico and the Bahamas, as well as Australia. Sorry about that. And try to think about extant organisms as a way of understanding how they had fossilized many billions of years ago. So it's a very long explanation. I hope that.
There's never a wrong moment to invoke Lynn Margulis in my book, and it's all the richer to be able to have it be that I feel she corrects a lot of the nearsightedness of sort of her contemporary colleagues in terms of how we even think of the cell processes that we take for granted, and sort of expanding and making the paleontological relevant to, you know, the histological tissue sample being analyzed underneath the microscope, to not ever lose sight of the timescales which one works in. But I'm going to now move you to outside of the stromatolite on Earth and to the extraterrestrial analog, perhaps, or of the stromatolite, which I really, this dual view is something that I think is fascinating, and I would love to hear more about what you have to say, because I understand this is also something that you're going to be working on for your upcoming book.
So the image that you're seeing is from an article in an astrobiology journal where basically astrobiologists are thinking about stromatolites as what they would call biosignatures, right? Evidence for past life beyond Earth. The reason why stromatolites have become key in the search is kind of manifold. I would say this: there is an understanding that contemporary Mars operates as a kind of proxy for early Earth, or vice versa, depending on who you're talking to. And as such, if you look at Mars now, it would be something that can provide a window onto what, well, sorry, I'm getting my timelines confused, which is something that I would be happy to talk about more later, because a lot of what's going on here has to do with what I think of as a kind of scientific time travel. What I'm trying to say is that looking at stromatolites like the one you just saw in that image of Strelly Pool is something that could point to evidence of past life on Mars, right? Mars no longer being habitable by most accounts, and yet could have had conditions similar to life on early Earth around the same time, right? 3.4 to 4 billion years ago. And that as such, you can go to places like here, this image is of Lake Thetis, see stromatolites, and then use that information to think about what life could be identifiable in a fossilized form on Mars. And indeed, in some of my early anthropological research around the preparation for the Mars 2020 rover mission, which is currently going on. I don't know if people are following it on Twitter, but I know I am. The reason why the particular landing site was chosen they had a menu of 150 possible sites. And I was lucky enough to get to be in the meetings where they slowly honed it down. It was always about stromatolites. What are the chances that this ancient environment could have harbored and then fossilized something that would look like a stromatolite? And over again, people would say the best case scenario, right? The fantasy for finding life on Mars is to find something that looks like a stromatolite.
Exciting, yes. There will be more on Mars rover later. I will move us to the next image, but first, thank you for that, because I want to keep our mind on that which is the analogous fossil formation in Mars. But first, to apologize for that typo, the minerals. It was the excitement of the image, I'm sure, that drove me there. It's actually minerals. But to go no further, to Mars Perseverance, this was taken in Sol 71, which on Earth is May 2nd, and yesterday. And yes, the excitement actually of the production of imagery as you're carrying out this research. And of course, you know, the excitement of being able to be in the room and with some of these discussions, but sort of seeing the real-time production of such a high volume of, you know, just high resolution imagery of the surface of Mars. I think this, I mean, lends a very sort of visual context to be thinking about this problem. And I was curious if, as you follow, you know, the NASA's and sort of live stream, as live as we can get, quote unquote, from Mars to here, what does that do to your mind and to your research as you're carrying forward? Is it so much so sort of the equal fixation of the morphological or the find of being able to trace to the stromatolite, or just in my mind, what often happens to me is just the sheer infrastructure that we're seeing, both not just the making of the photograph, but just the reality of the technological development that we're seeing unfold as the images are produced. But anyways, enough about me. I'm just very curious what it does to you.
That's a very complicated question, I think. So it's interesting that you're showing this image after showing the picture of me reflected in the stromatolite, because this is another kind of, unintentional selfie. Going back to my earlier comments about Derrida and the way he was writing about response and responsibility, one of the moments he picks up on is the way Lacan talked about the mirror stage, right? What it means to reflect and see a form that looks similar to oneself, and what kind of work that does. And Lacan says that it has to do with the relationship between the imaginative and the symbolic. And then Derrida kind of poses it as a question. Well, we know animals can be imaginative, but can they also be symbolic? And this is an interesting philosophical question, but kind of moving that issue aside, the issue of the mirror stage, one of the things he points to, and I don't know how intentional it is talking about the difference between humans and non-humans with regard to not making traces, but to erasing traces. And the language in which he does so is very much similar to the way people now talk about fossils, fossilization, and also some of the what I assume would be called biases of taphonomy, right? That creating a trace also always produces the conditions of its own erasure. And in that gap between creating a trace, creating a fossil, and the possibility of its erasure is what he thinks of as the gap between reaction and responsibility. So in many ways, it renders ambiguous the relationship between the human and the non-human, whether facing a cat naked or talking to a stromatolite in the hall, whatever it might be. I think that is a really curious moment that kind of presses against the limits of how we think about, what life is, how we can understand swaths of deep time, and this question of form, right? So going back to the rover, we're not talking about gathering biological material, at least not yet. This mission right now lives or dies by the question of form. What do we recognize as being lifelike? Not just lifelike as it is now, but what, on Sol, whatever it was, 71, looks like something that lived and died in Strelipool 3.4 billion years ago. And can we recognize it, right? That's what the response and responsibility is.
Absolutely. It's that is the excitement of whether we're able to recognize life. And I would say often with the nearsightedness of the inherited concepts that some of us trained in the life sciences would have. But going now more to, again, the analogous and to life on Earth, slowly going back to Earth with this image, but still staying on Mars for a bit, of other sort of challenging objects to think with about the sort of limit of the biotic and the abiotic. You have written very lovely texts about oohids, and I would love to both introduce the fact that you have a text for us, but also, talk about the fact that there are, again, this question of form and sort of the question of an accrual of the biotic and the abiotic, and that compression that we choose to sometimes see very rigidly in other areas of the life sciences as separate, but oohids take that and throw it out into the water. I would very much be curious to also hear your thoughts on this as well.
I'll get used to this someday, or hopefully I won't have to. Oohids are another funny thing in geobiology. They're a little bit alive, they're kind of not alive. Are they? I mean, this is a question that long predates modern life sciences. In fact, that's something I've been tracking. It goes back to at least the 16th century. But this question of why do these weird little egg-like forms form, and do they form in a way that has to do with the work of living organisms or not? And so one of the tasks I've taken up in this regard is, again, to write about them In first person, I've been doing a series of what I'm calling mineral autobiographies. And so I have a small excerpt that I can read about oohids, and I'll make it really brief because I'm aware that time is not on our side. I'll begin at the beginning. The world used to be a different sort of place, and I traipsed much more widely, coasting young seas before settling in contemporary climes. Let's surf back, 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 to when natural time encountered historical time, to when both lapsed into epochs geological. Skim with me along temporal swells to arrive at the mid-Archean eon, 3.2 billion years ago. Our Earth had just barely cooled. It was only now catching its breath after being pummeled by asteroids for millions of years. Before continents, before even Pangaea, there was a place named Ur, or maybe it was Valbara, no one really remembers. All life emerged here. Broad continental shelves accumulated limestone deposits as volcanoes disgorged lava and ash into alkaline seas. Microbes in hot oceans precipitated gelatinous iron and piped it in bands along the seafloor. Calcium-rich waters and shallow tropical seas were my first home. Here I would form a body, a concentric and repetitive glazing and rinsing of calcium carbonate, much like the way a pearl grows. Today I'm diminutive by comparison to what I once was, more than tenfold bigger than, benefiting from the once mineral-rich and agitated waters of a fledgling planet. Indeed, for millennia, I had the ocean all to myself. 600 million years ago, I basked freely in milky calcium carbonate-rich brine, slowly, ever so slowly, siphoning my body from its sumptuous waters. A nucleus of quartz or a fragment of lime would carom in a hot tide, lifted up in the ebb and flow of each driven wave, coating itself in a filmy skin of aragonite. This is where I begin. In shallow waters, I'd sink down to the seafloor, only to be buoyed up again, another dousing of mineral, and descend, rest, and float some more. As I rested, my cortex solidified, thin needles of white aragonite encircling me like a crown. And again, a little more crystalline veneer with each cycle, growing myself a body sphere in suspension, then sleeping in sediment. A storm would lash the waters into a frenzy in which I'd be buffeted about, cannoning into sediment and sand, scoured clean as a bone and polished gem lustrous. So after that beginning, I end up going into Walter Benjamin and the origin of German tragic drama, which I'm not going to do to you this evening. But I wrap up that account by talking about how currently oohids are now understood to be not organisms and not rocks or fossils, but instead entire tiny ecosystems that are filled with many different kinds of life. And from there, I also contemplate symbiogenesis as a way of understanding evolution over time beyond more common autopoetic ways of thinking about biological change. So the idea that when things evolve, they evolve in concert with one another, right? It's lots of different kinds of organisms and species creating a kind of biosphere unto themselves, right? Rather than everyone just competing to see who's fittest. And I use the oohid as kind of a model for how that can be thought about across deep time.
No, it's fascinating to hear you read one of what I've seen referred to as mineral autobiographies, and to have the oohid be that from which we actually need to piece quite literally the sort of the ideas of how we understand the living, again, to be both separate from that which is not living, but in the context, I think, of the broader expanse of the oceanic, and the kind of the oceanic as that which, to me at least, in the contemporary sense, it commingles so often that which in the terrestrial seems to be apparently more static. Is very exciting, and to be in that liminal space, of course, between the coast and shore, the space where fossilization takes shape across eons and epochs. It's very exciting to me. In keeping us in the ocean, though, I have to do a quick shift because, as you said, time unfortunately is not on our side, both geological and otherwise. And this fascinating story which you shared about what can happen or not happen in the depths of the ocean, and to kind of really challenge the ideas of decomposition is something that evolves both taphonomy and the integration of organic matter in an environment, but also the conditions in which it might not happen, as we can understand it from our own lived experience.
Right. So one of my current research interests is what's called deep biosphere. So microbes that live miles beneath the Earth's surface, often in rocks. So they're sought after in caves. There's been a lot of prior work on hydrothermal vents, which many of you I'm sure are already familiar with. But one of the kind of origin stories of deep biosphere research involves this sandwich. So the submersible you see in the photo is Alvin, which has been trawling the ocean for I think more than 50 years at this point. And there's a story that in 1968, there were some, I think 3 researchers who were supposed to go down to look at sub-ocean volcanoes, and the cables broke and Alvin fell to the bottom of the ocean. Everyone survived, but someone left their sandwich in the submersible, and because of bad weather, it couldn't be hauled back up for about 10 months. And what they found in 1969, when the sandwich was finally surfaced, was that it looked pretty much the same as it had 10 months prior. There was also an apple, and apparently they drank some beef broth that was kept in a thermos for 10 months and found that it tasted fine. So this was a moment in which people started thinking about whether the bottom of the ocean was what they called a microbial desert or not. If the sandwich didn't decay, did that mean that no life was present to make it decay? And on the flip side of that conversation, and this jump-started a lot of deep biosphere research, could it be that there are microbes deep beneath the ocean that are living at extremes of temperature and notably extremes of pressure, but that when they're brought back up to the surface, they die because our environment is extreme to them. And as a result of that, a lot of researchers began doing laboratory research on culturing microbes really deep at the bottom of the ocean, sort of in the same way that this sandwich was a kind of proto-experiment of that kind.
That's one of the things for those of us who are not in history of science or in STS, to have the moments when science is getting made and you have these things that seem as the snafus or the mistakes, but actually have those be the elucidating moments to be able to understand a lot of the research questions that haven't been posed because they haven't been imagined. It's something that to me excites me a lot. And I would say that, and that leads us to one of the things in terms of taphonomy and sort of the endless hair splitting that can happen in terms of understanding form, not of that which doesn't decompose, but that which is unique in that it's the only example of what we have to date of one particular species that has at least integrated through taphonomic means and otherwise into our environment and into our sort of imaginations, is the Tully Monster, which is a specimen that is in the Field Museum. And while the specimen here might seem to be something that doesn't quite evoke the imaginaries that one might expect, the images produced around the Tully Monster to understand where it sits in terms of sort of the interpretation of morphology to life on Earth, and how odd it is to imagine sometimes those elements, with even if we have the evidence to interpret it, is one of the things that I thought about immediately when you shared the story of the Alvin submarine. Not because the first necessarily dealt with paleontology and the questions of the fossil, but sort of the surprises that it can generate and the myths and stories around them. For those of you who may be familiar with the Tully Monster, anybody from Illinois will know this is your state fossil, actually. The Tully Monster has had reams written about it, and it was compared to the dancing worm of Lake Chicana, which was later told to be a hoax, but had actually carried enough weight to plan an expedition by the Field Museum. And in certain moments, when you look at the interpretation of taxonomy of species, that can perhaps be pieced more concretely and placed into an origin phylogenetically determined or otherwise, it nevertheless makes me think of the moments in the pockets of mystery and just complete surprise to have somebody not be able to understand the form and not be able to place it. Because to this day, the Tully Monster is still not known if it's a vertebrate, if it's an invertebrate, or dare I say, even an other. So again, this is just to share. And I see that we have about sort of 15 minutes late. So I know that I introduced the Tully Monster, of which I would welcome any response, but I really want to bring it more again, actually perhaps closer to what you've written in the past, in the idea of life and interpreting sort of that which arrives to Earth that we also can't place and can split hairs endlessly about whether it shows traces of life or not. This here is a section of the Allen Hills 84001 meteorite, which is a storied meteorite, to say the least, because it is one of the ones that really still to this day divides scientists, and whether they fall on the side of that it shows signs of life, traces of life, or not. And Sophia has written about it in several of her pieces, so I'll let her take on from here.
Thank you. Right, so this meteorite was found in Antarctica and studied pretty extensively. I think it's perhaps the most infamous meteorite in astrobiology, because the work that has been shared publicly kind of it's a story of a kind of scientific misstep, right? So there was a big press conference in 1996, I believe, when Bill Clinton talked about the possibility that life on Mars had been discovered because there were these little microspherules that could be seen under an electron microscope inside the meteorite. And in terms of autobiography, this was a really momentous kind of press conference for me. I remember watching it on morning TV before school when I was 12 and being very excited that life on Mars had finally been found. And of course it hadn't been, or no one really knows. Spherules can be signs of all sorts of things. And we were gonna spend some time talking about carbonaceous chondrites, that is meteorites that, unlike a lot of metallic meteorites, are made primarily out of carbon. So these can be sort of proxies or windows into events that happened around the formation of our solar system, but also have been for a very long time studied by Earth and life scientists as a way of thinking about the possibility that life did not originate on this planet, but rather arrived here from other worlds. So with regard to that work, again, and I know I'm kind of hammering on this, but so much of this conversation has to do not with material constituents, but rather with form, right? What does the interior of the meteorite look like? What does it look like under a microscope? How can we interpret what is going on with regard to biological form? And biological form is, and this is a term of art for geologists, dubious. So there are fossils that are definite fossils. There are fossils that are definitely not fossils. That is, they used to be thought of as fossils, and now we know that they're abiotic. Those are two categories. And then in the middle is the pseudo-fossil, and in the middle is the dubio-fossil, right? Fossils, pseudo-fossils, dubio-fossils. And form is, as geologists are very aware and keen to talk about, dubious. What looks like an ancient microbe is usually just a sphere, and a sphere can be formed under lots of abiotic conditions. So going back to the Allen Hills meteorite, this was one of these kinds of missteps or gaffes, I think, in the history of astrobiology. And that being said, I think a lot of people only know about astrobiology because of some of these moments, these particular meteorites, like Allen Hills, like the Murchison meteorite in Australia, and like this meteorite, Aguas Arcas, which I think just arrived last year or the year before.
Yeah, 2019, it crashed down on someone's roof. It's now the site of a ranch that in other times, pre-pandemic times, may have been a destination for me, because I was like very excited when the news of the meteorite came down, literally, with the sort of the question that I think makes the carbonation chondrite meteorites more complex, which is, can there be, aside from the sort of reading a form, the presence of amino acids? And can that be something that can be traced, which is of course still following a form, perhaps not as the one that the Allen Hills meteorite lent itself for, those kind of discussions. But yes, it's part of it is still, I believe, it is in the Center for Meteorite Studies in Arizona State University, and part of it is still in Costa Rica. And well, we're hanging by the edge of our seats to see what happens in the lab and otherwise. But to the idea of perhaps the chondrite being something that brings us to Germany, and sort of the histories of the chondrite, and the fascinating sort of moments of intersection between sort of the study of the geological specimen in the form of meteorite and sedimentation. I was very happy when you mentioned Otto Hahn in a previous conversation we had, because it's lends itself to sort of the intersection with Johannes Walter, who was a contemporary. He's not a petrologist, he was a sedimentologist. He wrote significantly about facies, the law of facies, or the kind of this formation of the strata that you can read. But the sort of, again, to the formal, be it the cross section of a piece of land, of geological terrain, or a very thin, section of a meteorite. I am fascinated by Otto Hahn and his 142 photographs in the back of his book. No small feat at the time of its publication, and would be very curious to hear how he, among perhaps another set of characters, might be entering into your writing or into your research.
I'm really excited because I didn't know anyone else knew about Otto Hahn. So I came across Otto Hahn twice in different ways, and then I kind of like made the connection. Wasn't that hard, but basically Otto Hahn, I mentioned earlier this dawn animal of Canada, Eozoon canadense. This was a putative fossil, or dubio fossil, honestly, of what was supposed to be this organism, this organism that predated all other life on Earth, right? Dawn animal of Canada. And dawn animal of Canada was sort of like a useful fossil. The reason why it was kind of discovered in 1859 is Darwin had just published Origin of Species, and he said, and this is now known as Darwin's dilemma, if my theory is right, then there's a lot of stuff missing from the fossil record. And then lo and behold, Eozoon appears. And some samples are in fact stromatolites, some are just a little bit of serpentinite that's fortuitously arranged to look lifelike. So John Dawson was the head of the Geological Survey in Canada, I believe. He was the main person who was publicizing Eozoon. And that's where Otto Hahn first comes into the story. He was a kind of Swedenborgian petrologist person who was skeptical of Eozoon, but traveled to Canada to work directly with Dawson, took samples back with him to Germany, and determined that he thought they were in fact precursors of all life on Earth, although he thought they were plants, not animals. So he renamed the fossil Eophyllum. And once he decided that Eophyllum was a fossil, he started finding fossils everywhere, including in carbonaceous chondrites. So these are some of the images, and this is kind of astonishing from a technological perspective as well. These are among the first what we would call photomicrographs, right? Photos that were taken under a microscope. And they're of interiors of meteorites. And he said, not only does the meteorite contain fossils, he claimed, and this is in a book, I have a quote with me, in 1880, he said, in my study of 20 chondrites, the assertion made in my Urzel, this is an earlier book about the first cell, was confirmed. The rock of the chondrites is not a type of sedimentary rock on Earth in which fossils are embedded. Rather, its whole mass is entirely formed of organic beings, like coral rocks. And so he concludes, so it is not a plant, as I had assumed earlier, but plant animals, the whole stone is life, right? That it's not, right, it's not containing fossils, but it is in itself this kind of like rich fossilized ecosystem, the whole thing. Which is sort of astonishing, right? So we get from stromatolites and eozoon into meteorites and also astrobiology, because I should also mention that a little bit earlier than this, but not much, Lord Kelvin, in writing about meteorites, was also talking about astrobiology. And he said perhaps it's conceivable that life arrived here on Earth, and this is a quote, on mossy fragments from the ruins of former worlds, right? Which kind of pushes back the question of origins. It didn't happen here, it happened elsewhere, right? In ruins of a previous planet. And then so we can loop back and all of a sudden we have a Mars rover kind of tooling around in 2020, looking for something that might look like a stromatolite, a quote unquote mossy fragment.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Again, time being not on our side, I mean, move on to the last actually set of images, and it brings us back to Germany, keeps us in the same kind of time frame of Otto Hahn loosely, and sort of that of the life that which you've written so much in, also of this particular sort of moment of the Huxley and Ernst Haeckel going back and forth in terms of like how to interpret what ultimately was defined to not be biotic, but which had a lot of traction for a while there of it being actually something biotic. And to keep us again in sort of that German context, for many reasons, I would love to hear you speak also of this as well, though I should say we should read you, for those who haven't, you should certainly read what Sophia has written as well. So I'll toss it back to you.
Yeah, so really briefly, and I am aware of the time. This is what's described as Urschleim, right, or Bathybius haeckeli, named after Ernst Haeckel, but discovered by Thomas Henry Huxley from this deep sea dredging in 1868 of a ship that was trying to lay transatlantic undersea cables. So the question was, this goo that came from the seafloor, was it alive or not? Well, it looked alive to many at the time. It was only later described just as kind of ooze or mud. But again, coming back to this question of form, what does life look like? Would we recognize it when we see it? This was part of that same kind of frisson around eozoon that began with Darwin saying, Darwin's dilemma, is there evidence of fossils before the Precambrian, or he would call it the Silurian, and the sort of unmasking a little bit after Otto Hahn, I guess in the 1890s, that this wasn't really what people thought it was. And so it's this kind of rich moment for about 3 decades where people are looking at all sorts of stuff, right? Goo from the seafloor, rocks, and these kind of weird lithified entities, and really are at a loss as to whether these are true signs of life or not. And I point to this again, not to say, oh, well, we know so much more now because we can identify, proto-amino acids in a meteorite, but to say, no, this is almost to the letter the same conversation that continues to this day when people are looking at, pieces of very old crystalline matrices that predate continents and say, well, it might look alive. It could just be a rock that has fortuitous arrangements that look lifelike. And this kind of looping conversation about what is life and what does it look like? Would we recognize it in, the deep past or elsewhere? Brings me back to this idea that this is an actor's category. It's conceptual, and as such we can read these images and the way people interpreted these forms and reflect back on what people assumed life was at the time and what we think of it now.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, I think we need to talk about, with the greater audience, what is life? How do we think of life and what it is now? But I just included the title of Sophia's article, Life Not Itself, Anatomy and the Limits of Biology, one text where she writes about this. But I am going to say that unfortunately for now, this part of the conversation, this image-based part of the conversation, although you never know, some might trickle in the Q&A, is for the most part done. But I would love to open it now, the floor to those of us who are, those of you, us broadly, in the audience that might have now some questions. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat, also where I included the reference to Sophia's article. But if you feel so inclined, you can also raise your hand and speak out your question as well. And for the moment, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can actually have visibility of folks who will be asking questions. I don't know if anybody would like to start, or else I will continue, because there are many questions I have actually for Sophia, which this is a very small cross section. Let me see and check. Well, yes, Elke, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophia. That was incredible. It's really amazing. I'm so thankful, and congratulations. It's so powerful, and we heard so many new things. I would like to ask you a question, because I was really thrilled by this idea of a kind of a new model. You were talking about the oohids, if I pronounce it right, this tiny little ecosystems, and you said something like, when things evolve, they evolve with one another. Could you explore a little bit of what you mean? Like this could be a model for what exactly? A societal model, or what do you mean exactly? Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that question. This is something that's been written about in the last few decades. First, I already mentioned the work of Lynn Margulies, so I'll bring her up one more time. Lynn Margulies was the person who developed the theory of what's called endosymbiosis, right? So when you think about eukaryotic cells like the ones we have in our bodies, she posed the theory, which is now accepted, that in fact our cells are the result of sort of devouring or joining with bacteria. So some subcomponents of cells like mitochondria are in fact once free living organisms that kind of joined together and became eukaryotic cells. So this theory wasn't accepted at the time that it was first posed, in large part because neo-Darwinian theory was so regnant at the time that the understanding was that, you know, each species is kind of competing for survival for a particular environmental niche, and that there was no room for something like different kinds of organisms joining together into something that looks something between sex and eating, right? To kind of glom together. And now symbiogenesis is being written about not only by biologists, but also it's become a kind of useful concept in philosophy of biology, in particular in feminist philosophy of biology, by people, most notably, I think Donna Haraway is doing a lot of this work to make a claim for thinking about how entities, not just biological, but more broadly, get on and survive by means of collaboration, by means of mutually constitutive production of certain kinds of environments in which we can all thrive. So in this respect, it's also very much related to the Gaia hypothesis, which notably people think the Gaia hypothesis was about Earth. It was originally formulated to talk about Mars and to make the claim that we didn't need to look for life on Mars because the planet itself was clearly devoid of life, right? So the Gaia hypothesis, as it's now understood with regard to Earth, is a way of talking about how life creates the conditions in which it itself will flourish, right? So things like stromatolites produced an oxygen-rich environment, which made possible the rise of plants and animals. But that understanding of this kind of bootstrapping effect, this flourishing of a different kind of environment, wasn't something that would be admitted by, right, a neo-Darwinian theory where, right, there is an ecological niche and you either survive in it or you don't, rather than this kind of like give and take and complicated pull between lots of different kinds of organisms that are themselves producing a kind of ecological space, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question and the Q&A. Do you think your work about the living dimension of the lithic could help to have a broader perspective towards an urgent reconnection with the living in times of climate change and mass extinction?
Oh my goodness. That's a big question. Yes, so I'm gonna take a stab at it, and then you can tell me if it sounds right, or you can elaborate on what I've said. I think that there is a way of thinking about deep time that makes climate change, but just generally the ways in which right, anthropogenic things can happen at a planetary level more accessible and understandable. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you read the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty, right, who is the person who is, he's the critical theorist who made the Anthropocene something that humanists talked about rather than just natural scientists. He has a passage in, I think it's one of the early critical inquiry pieces, where he says, swaths of geological time are simply unfathomable to people, and that's the problem, right? And I see what he's trying to do in a political register. He's trying to say we can't be pushed to make these changes because we simply cannot understand what it means to think across a billion years. I think he's wrong insofar as I don't know who he means by we. And my work with geologists has made clear that lots of people learn how to think about billions of years in a really sensorially rich and embodied way. So the claim that we cannot do that seems to be really particular, and yet he's treating it as a universal. I'm not doing this just to pick a fight with Dipesh Chakrabarty. I want to make clear sort of what the stakes of the claim are. So if you think beyond earth sciences into storytelling and narrative, we could say, well, the novel kind of operates on the range of a lifespan, but there are lots of other forms of storytelling that do not. We could talk about myths or sagas as other ways of contending with deep time and making them palpable for a human audience. And I think that's what, or what I hope this thinking about the lithic could potentially do.
Oh, wonderful, thank you. Impressive answer to a very broad and large, wealthy question. Joanny Galizia, one of the jurors and the group entomologist from the University of Constance, I'm going to allow him to speak so that he can use his own voice and to have your own response.
So Sophia, thank you very, very much. This is amazing. It's a wonderful story and so many new ideas in my head. One of the things that struck me is you're really working at the borderline between life and not life. And many of the examples that you showed were also about thinking is something that you see alive, or has it been alive in deep time? And I understood that self-organization, regularity, the shape of things, the materiality of what you see is an important criterion. Now, what I would wonder is when you think so much about this border between what is alive and what is not alive. That is a divide that is difficult also today, right? In real time, when we think how to define life and not life. And I was wondering whether your work in deep time influences your thinking about where is the borderline between living and not living today, right? Would that help you in I don't know, phrasing a definition of what is life?
Another big question. Just to clarify for a moment, Giovanni, when you say to help me think about what life is in the contemporary moment, did you mean in a biological sense, in a socio-political sense, ethical?
Oh, yes, I'm a biologist, so I think in a biological terms. So would a virus be life? Would a cell, do you need a cell to have life, or could you create artificial life? So where do you define life and not life in a biological sense? Yes.
Thank you. Well, so it's interesting. I'm collaborating with some colleagues on a text that's titled "What is Life?" that explicitly addresses sort of the repetition of this question through the life sciences. And some notable examples would be Schrödinger posing the question, but there are hundreds of others who have asked in books and in articles and chapters, "What is life?" And in drafting the conclusion, it's going to appear in Leipzig's Spectre Press this fall. We were reflecting on what the contemporary moment might tell us about how the question has been asked and answered. And I feel like the past year has demonstrated both the importance of the question and its severe limitations. I think a lot of the theorizing amongst biologists about what life is, what the limits of life might be, has come down to questions of, for example, viruses, right? Is a virus alive or not? Should we think of it as living because it contains nucleic acids, because it can make more of itself? Should we think of it as not truly living because it's not quote unquote free living, right? It cannot exist on its own outside of a cellular host. And COVID has made very clear that it doesn't really matter whether we call it life or non-life. We live with it, and it has profound impact on our lives now. And I think that this means that the question has both been worried for different kinds of reasons in the past, right? So I think of, I don't know if you're familiar with the definition. Oh, now I can't remember who offered it. If anyone in the audience remembers, please type it in. This is a definition from the 60s. Oh, I think it was Peter Medawar, that a virus is a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein, right? So there's a way in which this kind of materiality and this theorizing of what life is, what isn't, leaves out a lot of important stuff. And so it's something that I do think about today, especially with regard to my earlier work on synthetic biology and efforts to make life in the lab. But I also have been thinking about it with regard to what it means to live. And I know you said that you're coming from a biological perspective, but what does it mean to ask the question, what is life in an age of pandemic, in an age of Black Lives Matter, in an age of environmental devastation and degradation? What does it mean to say that you can't breathe for Black Lives Matter participants, for people in India right now? And why is it that biology is so not the right tool set to begin to address these questions of profound ethical import?
Thank you.
Oh, I really want to follow up that question. It's one of the ones I had, especially with regards to the viral and highlighting the role of female scientists that are pushing that question, specifically a virologist that I'm thinking about a lot with since the last 2 years is Karen Moiling, who's at, among many places, University of Zurich and at the Max Planck Institute of Molecular Genetics. And she has this fascinating set of articles in a book, Viruses More Friends Than Foes, or Viroids First. And aside from her work, her very applied work in sort of in a pathological context, herself investigating pathology, not pathology and investigation. I wanted to ask you about sort of the theory of viruses being actually a way of thinking of life on Earth, a sort of a model for life on Earth, Mars, and exoplanets, which it's actually borrowing directly from a title by Morling. Has the sort of the presence of the viral very directly in your life made it so that you think through some of these questions, both in the context of the terrestrial and the extraterrestrial? You've written about panspermia, of course, and the question of sort of how life begins on Earth. I'm very curious, especially in light of your previous work in synthetic biology, just how is this parsing your thinking? I know another unfair question, heavily stacked, but one which I just can't help but ask.
Right. So the figure of the virus, I think we could talk about it in a rhetorical sense. We could talk about it in a material sense, and that would have different kinds of effects. I think in talking about what's happening now with regard to the pandemic and with regard to biotechnological responses to the pandemic, I think about not just the figure of the virus as something that infects us, but also about technologies like CRISPR, which are in fact evolved ways of bacteria learning how to deal with viruses, right? And how that technology then gets co-opted by people in order to develop things like tests, possibly therapeutics, all that kind of stuff, right? So the figure of the virus is something that is whose effects are felt at different levels and with different possibilities opening up from them. But I want to press more on this question of the free living. And I'm not familiar with the virologist who you mentioned, although I'll definitely look her up. One of the things that I've been confounded by, and I'm not the only one, I mean, this is a question for feminist philosophy of biology more broadly, is the way in which viruses have confounded definitions of life, not only because of their putative minimalism, but also because of the assumptions that people have made about what constitutes not just life, but also an individual organism, right? As being something that is genetically unitary, despite the fact that, much of our genome is made up of lots of other kinds of species, that an organism is something that is self-contained, both in time and in space, that it is unitary, that it has a certain kind of identity, whether morphological or genetic, and how really simple things like pregnancy completely upset all of those definitions of what counts as an organism. And I think if you spend more time thinking about these kinds of complex relays between different species, between different life forms, but also just the nuts and bolts of what biology looks like beyond the cell, beyond the neo-Darwinian, beyond the genetic understanding of how replication, reproduction take place, there's a lot more to it that hasn't been fully, if not recognized, at least absorbed or metabolized into the way biology is doing its work, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And it's so wonderful that, well, you mentioned pregnancy, because in fact, one of the things that Karen Mullen writes about in one article I just slipped into the chat, in case anybody's interested, is precisely the question of mammalian placenta and sort of what it does to our understandings of viruses, retroviruses amongst them. And it's just a question of sort of the role of the virus in our own genome, and in the context not just of disease, but as a configuration of what we understand ourselves to be, but in the context of evolution, which he very interestingly poses in sort of the early Earth context, or how to understand the virus as a model for actual transmission of genetic information. It's a note. I'm very humbled to be able to offer you a reference, because you've offered so many to me, and that it's really wonderful to be able to have you as part of this conversation, of which very unfortunately I'm going to have to draw to a close, not out of my own will and volition, I might say, but if there's any other burning question amongst the audience that you just have to ask, say it now, or else I will have to sadly bring this to a close, but not without thanking Sophia very much, not only for her intellectual generosity, her open creativity, and really for this experiment in image-based, compressed, distanced conversation, and also say look forward to your book now, the one on what is life, or if that's the title, if I understood it correctly, coming up this fall, but also more importantly, The Quick and the Dead, which shall be something, again, as I say, many of us are looking forward to. But again, thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you all, both behind the scenes and everybody who made it possible at Schloss. Really, thanks for this. And be safe, good health.
Thank you.